Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
First, I want to thank everybody for taking their time on this Friday rainy afternoon because I know that everybody's ready to get home to their families, but I will not keep you long. Today, I will be talking about my long-term project, and so we'll just dive right in. The focus was to examine the effectiveness of the RTI process when properly monitored and implemented and its impact on student achievement. Now, when we met a few months ago and we looked at my short term, what we were talking about initially was our RTI and the pulse checks. But as Dr. Cloud and I looked further and wanted to dig a little deeper, we wanted to go more into the implementation and not just look at the documentation piece, but step away from the table. And so that's what we'll talk about, and that's what I'll be looking at with my long term. So we'll begin with our goals. Anything that we do is always aligned with our county's goals. So the first county or district goal, Kemp Primary, will be in alignment with our district goal of school improvement, academic achievement plan, and also keeping with that alignment, Kemp will continue the efforts to improve student achievement through interventions and professional development. Our goal 1, Kemp Primary, will continue to enhance the fidelity with which our RTI process is implemented. Our goal 2, Kemp Primary, will increase student performance on our DIBELS assessment based on the beginning of the year benchmark to the middle of the year benchmark during the 2018-2019 school year. When we looked at the team is critical to the short-term and long-term project in that we all are hands-on with the process, our RTI process. So our team is made up of our grade chairs, our school psychologist, our behavioral specialist, our principal, Dr. Cloud, and myself. This is also important because we're all parts of the circle of support. And we know that the circle of support is new to our district this year in that it helps, or our team looks at certain students and their issues and then looks at the things that are in place within the school and also the people and other resources that we have outside of the district to help our students to be successful. When looking at finding the story and the priority questions, based on our school goal of enhancing the RTI process and increasing student achievement on DIBELS, the team posed the initial questions. How do we effectively monitor the fidelity of the small group interventions? And then question 2, how do we ensure that the teachers have a thorough understanding of the prescribed interventions that are outlined in the Clayton County Manual? And you all know we've been in meetings before and we've said, okay, does everyone understand? Do you have any questions? And most of the time, what does everybody say? We understand. No, we don't have any questions. But it's different when you get that piece of paper and it's time to actually put into place that practice, and then you may have some questions. So we really wanted to dig deep to see, do they have a thorough understanding? So let's look back for just a second. The background for the study came about due to our need to monitor the fidelity of our RTI process as it relates to the documentation. Everybody knows that when they see our binder, they know what time it is. It's time for our pulse checks. So with the pulse checks, we have the folders that are being used, we have the documentation. With that documentation, we also have the table of contents and how we want everything to be structured. So we modeled the process when we first got started with our pulse checks. Just like Jada has her red tabletop, we have our round tabletop. So we come and that's really what we do when we sit down. Now initially, the teachers were apprehensive in terms of sitting down because they didn't know what to expect. But then as they started moving through the process, they became more comfortable and then the process started to flow smoothly. But once we got started with our pulse checks and then they knew what to expect, then everything just flowed from there. But once again, as I said before, we have to be able to get away from the table to see what's going on. We have the process in terms of the documentation and what everybody needs to have in their folders, but what happens in the classroom was still what we needed to know. So we talked about our roundtable talks, and then some of the documents that were included in the folders are their Tier 2 summaries, their intervention tracking sheets, of course, current copies of student work, their report cards, and then if it's for behavior, they would have the progress monitoring tool for the behavior as well. In thinking about how to really examine the effectiveness of the RTI checks, I knew it would be imperative to move away from our table, our comfort zone, so to speak, which is our why. That's why we're here, into those classrooms and really dig deep and look at the interventions to see the what. What are they doing, and are those interventions being implemented the way that they're supposed to be implemented? So in the beginning, we wanted to ensure that there were no surprises. We wanted to make sure that we had complete transparency. We wanted to also make sure that the schedules were aligned, that were related to the implementation. Make sure, we told our teachers also to make sure that they had a prescribed time and day to implement those interventions. And then that we would be coming in, doing our visits, and providing immediate feedback. If you look at the form that I provided for you, this is a form that we introduced this year, and we call them our flexing and flossing sheets. So it's a time to flex and floss and just basically show us what you're doing. When we go in, or we're going in to look at the implementation of the interventions, we will be focusing on, and I've highlighted it for you, the independent practice or the application of the intervention. The understanding. Is the student really understanding what's taking place with that particular probe? The scaffolding, what scaffolding took place prior to implementing the intervention, and then the front-loading strategies, how the teacher provided that information prior to digging deep with those probes. And then in the bottom, in the notes section, if there are any comments or suggestions, Dr. Cloud and I provide that when we go in. It's also important to have that immediate feedback, so within 48 hours of the visits, the teachers have a copy with the notations so they'll know what to expect and then know how well they did with that intervention. The research questions, once again, how do we effectively monitor the fidelity of the small group interventions? And how do we ensure that the teachers have a thorough understanding of the prescribed interventions as outlined in our Clayton County Intervention Manual? In doing the research for my long term, there were several research articles that were aligned to RTI. And RTI is not new, it's been around for years, but I found 3 that were directly aligned to our demographics and also to the research that I'm doing. The relationship between RTI implementation and reading achievement, a school level analysis, was the first lit review. In the synopsis with this piece, I just basically picked out those key words. This study focused on implementation integrity as it relates to the reading and then the students' reading outcomes. And we know that anything that you do, you have to make sure that it's done with consistency, fidelity, and integrity. The findings here with this particular study revealed that the database decision making and the Tier 3 implementation integrity significantly predicted student reading outcomes. So when the interventions are done and they're consistent, students perform better. Lit Review 2, classroom reading instruction that supports struggling readers, the key components for effective teaching. And here, the National Research Council of the NRC basically pointed out that most reading problems can be prevented by providing effective instruction and intervention in preschool and primary grades. And we teach and preach this all the time. Those foundational skills are critical. The phonemes, the segmentation, those nonsense words, the blending, they have to make sure that they're able to do that, the decoding, prior to matriculating to those early grades. To those later grades. And it's critically important that if the students don't understand it, we address it now to meet those needs. The NRC also talked about how students need to understand, practice reading enough to become fluent readers, learn that new vocabulary, and also learn to self-monitor. And this is one of the things that we also discuss with our teachers too. Formal register is important. It's important to talk to kids and use formal register and speak proper English. So that way, when they hear something spoken and it's improper, they'll know. It should sound or ring differently in the ear. And then when they are reading or speaking, it should also transfer, and they should eventually be able to do that self-correction. And then Lit Review 3, the study of effectiveness of response to intervention used in elementary school. And basically the synopsis for this Lit Review, the findings in the study were limited due to the migratory nature of the students. And with this one particular review, a lot of the students had left the district for various reasons. And the issue was when they returned, for those that did return, they didn't know if the intervention was being implemented in the other schools, or if it was implemented with consistency or fidelity. So those were some of the issues that they had. When looking at the comparison with our students, our demographics, and the Lit Reviews, the school and district, ours is very transient. The consistency of the intervention is instrumental to the RTI process and the success of it. Data has to be accurate on our students as they move through the tiers. We don't want a child to stay in tier 2 for a year. We don't want a child to just be stagnant in the tiers. The purpose is if that child needs to move through the tiers, make sure that you're implementing the interventions, make sure that you have the accurate data and that it's up to date. So if there's a need to move, that they're able to move successfully. Also, the K2 level is the most critical, as we discussed, for RTI implementation. I also pointed out the fact, too, that when students are younger, they're nicer. Even though there may be differences in the learning and the maturity, they don't really know it just yet. As they get older, they know. They start to notice the differences. No, I can't decode. No, I don't understand segmenting. No, I can't read that word. And then the other students are a little meaner. So if we're able to address those issues early on to get them on the same playing field, then we need to do that. The data for the project, there were 3 different types that were examined. We had the perception data, the school process data, and then the student learning data, which is still in progress. With perception data, out of the 28 teachers who were interviewed during the roundtable discussions, 20 of those 28 were very positive about administration coming in and observing the interventions being implemented. 16 of those 28 stated that they were happy or pleased about this type of observation and welcomed that feedback. 6 of the 28 stated that they liked the template, the flossing and flexing sheets that I showed you all earlier that we implemented this year. 3 of the 28 teachers stated that they didn't see the need to observe interventions and felt the post checks provided enough information. No, we don't need you to come in. No, this is enough. So 3 of the 28 felt that way. Out of the 28 teachers that were interviewed during the roundtable discussions, all 28 stated that prior to this school year, and actually it was last year on into this year, that RTIs were implemented, but there wasn't a checks and balances system that we have in place now. And there had never been a time where the actual observation of the intervention was done. 22 of the 28 teachers stated that they felt a lot more comfortable discussing RTI process at the school with the parents, and that the parents are more receptive. And then 5 out of the 7 parents that I interviewed about the experience stated that they had never had the process explained in such detail, and that with the meetings that they attended, they were very thorough. Also, when asked, the parents that I spoke with stated that they would be on board because they understood, and the teachers did such a dynamic job with explaining and having the paperwork, that if there was a need to move through the tiers and move to tier 3, that they would be on board. So that's a plus. And these are just our slides that go along with the narrative, the attitudes toward the RTI implementation. Give you all a minute to look at those. but just another visual. The next visual or chart is the perception of the RTI.
Ms. Johnson, you have a phone call in the main office. Ms. Johnson, if you're still in the building, you have a phone call in the main office. Thank you.
Once again, the perceptions of the RTI process as it relates to the implementation. And then our next slide is the parent's perception about the process, and just in chart form. As it relates to the school processes, as I mentioned earlier in the previous slide, the RTIs were implemented in the previous years, but not a real checks and balances system. And there wasn't any accountability as it relates to the RTIs, and so the students continued to struggle. Teachers also expressed that there wasn't a formal process that was being followed throughout until last year leading into this year. They also stated that, once again, that they had never been observed implementing the RTI interventions and received that feedback like we have on our flossing and flexing sheets until now. As a result, in the past 3 years, students may have not have moved through the tiers as quickly as they needed to. Some of the data was insufficient data, and then there was also a lack of implementation. Teachers expressed that students continue to struggle due to the lack of proper supports and an effective process. And then 25 out of the 28 teachers stated that they felt having a systematic process in place would ultimately help our students to achieve the success needed and to make the improvements in their learning. The overview of monitoring the process, the initial meeting with the teachers, which was conducted, securing the schedules with the allotted times of the day the interventions would be implemented and the time, monitoring using our flossing and flexing sheets, completing the feedback on the observation forms, providing a copy to teachers within 48 hours, and then allowing teachers that opportunity for conversation if they had any questions or concerns about the comments. Looking at the longitudinal piece regarding student learning, I just highlighted the bold and the major part. The results showed that our students were moving from the intensive to strategic, and then from strategic to benchmark, and from benchmark to above benchmark in the area of reading. Now at this point, we only have our BOY on the beginning of the year DIBELS data. We are in the process now of conducting the middle of the year testing. So once the testing concludes, the team is going to analyze the data and make the comparisons from beginning of the year to middle of the year. And then in May, we'll convene again and do a final comparison to look at the academic increases. And we are certain that there will be for the 2018-2019 school year. Based on the findings, the data team found that the teachers who were observed were consistent with their practices and the proper implementation of the identified interventions. And there has been an increase in the number of students who are making steady academic gains and progress monitoring gains on their DIBELS probe. So that's a plus. The impact of proper implementation on our students' academic achievement as it relates to the DIBELS middle of the year benchmark is yet to be determined until after our testing culminates. What I went ahead and did was provided the sentence frames. So once we convene after testing culminates and disaggregate the data, I'll plug in these sentence frames. And so you'll see intensive, the strategic. For example, with intensive, based on DIBELS, middle of the year reading data of the blank number of students that were intensive at BOY, this many remained, another percentage of students progressed to strategic, another percentage progressed to benchmark, and then another percentage progressed to above benchmark. But each area already has the sentence frame in place, so we just have to plug in the data once testing culminates. Same thing for the benchmark and above benchmark. We'll also be able to do the comparison head count And we'll do one for kindergarten, the first grade, and second grade, BOY to MOY. As we continue to shift from that process to implementation, the team determined or called on the following. They said that we should include the monitoring the fidelity of the small group interventions through our teacher observations as part of the process. They responded by saying that, and we answered the call. Yes, monitoring the intervention was included. Providing immediate feedback was also suggested to our teachers after observing. Immediate feedback was provided using our observation tool. Modeling the proper implementation of those interventions from the manual. Mrs. Cooper, Mrs. Thrasher, and I role-played for our teachers in terms of how to implement the behavior as well as the academic interventions, even going as far as to create some of the interventions for students that were on behavior plans. So they really were able to get a deep understanding of what it should look like and what it should sound like. I think they enjoyed the role play too. As we continue through our process over time, we'll analyze how monitoring the implementation of the interventions will enable our teachers to become more intentional. Also, as a result of the systematic implementation and continued monitoring of interventions, students will, notice I said will, we're confident that they'll make more gains from the beginning of the year to mid-year and from mid-year to end of the year on their DIBELS reading assessment. And then over time, the hope is that there will be a shift in the role of the administrators, not just here with what Dr. Cloud and I do as overseers of the process, but overseers of the implementation process as we share our success. Are there any questions? Don't all raise your hands at the same time. Okay, team, if there aren't any questions, that concludes my presentation of my long-term project. Once again, I thank you so much for your time and attention.